Hi, my beautiful, cheerful, and lovely family. Welcome back to your one and only home, Mr. Peter Stories. I hope each and every one of you is doing well, feeling blessed, and surrounded by love. Before we begin, let's take a moment for something truly special, a heartfelt prayer for anyone feeling stressed, lost, or in need of peace. Dear God, I lift up my beautiful family to you. Fill their hearts with strength, peace, and boundless happiness. Ease their burdens, calm their worries, and bless their paths with love and success. Let them always feel your presence, guiding them toward joy and fulfillment. Amen. Today is not just any day. It is a day overflowing with love, laughter, and beautiful emotions. My beloved sister is getting married. My heart is bursting with joy, and I can't wait to see her step into this new chapter of her life, filled with endless happiness. Please, my beautiful family, keep her in your prayers for a marriage blessed with love, peace, and prosperity. Now tell me, how did you feel about the last story? Did it touch your heart? Did it make you dream, smile, or even shed a tear? Every time you share your love in the comments, my heart swells with gratitude. Your words, your support, your presence, it all means the world to me. So, my beautiful family, get ready. Today's journey is one of love, passion, and emotions so deep they'll leave your heart racing. Sit back, relax, and let's dive into a story that will stay with you long after it ends. The early morning sun painted Manhattan's skyline in hues of gold and amber as Reese Holden emerged from the 6 train at Grand Central Station. Her heart fluttered beneath her crisp white blouse as she joined the river of commuters flowing through the terminal's cavernous main concourse. The constellation-scattered ceiling above seemed to mirror the stars still dancing in her dreams. Dreams that had carried her from the red clay roads of Millbrook, Georgia, to this concrete jungle of possibilities. Reese paused before the terminal's famous clock, its opal face gleaming like a full moon above the rushing crowds. She had arrived an hour early for her interview at Vespa Industries, but punctuality had been ingrained in her since childhood. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable. The memory brought both comfort and a sharp pang of homesickness. The reflection in a nearby shop window caught her attention. Her natural hair, styled in elegant twisted coils, crowned her head like a royal diadem. She had debated straightening it for the interview, but had ultimately decided against it. "Let them see all of me," she had told her reflection that morning. "The real me." Her deep brown eyes, flecked with hints of amber, held the same determination that had earned her a full scholarship to MIT and graduated her summa cum laude. Her carefully chosen outfit, a tailored navy blazer over a white silk blouse matched with a pencil skirt and modest heels, spoke of professional confidence without trying too hard to impress. The small golden pendant at her throat, her grandmother's good luck charm, completed the ensemble. It was simple, elegant, and utterly herself. As she navigated the busy streets of Midtown, Reese's mind wandered back to the path that had led her here. Growing up in Millbrook, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business before sundown, she had always felt like a square peg in a round hole. While other girls dreamed of settling down with local boys and raising families, Reese had spent countless nights beneath the Georgia stars, coding on her second-hand laptop and dreaming of bigger things. Her father, the town's high school mathematics teacher, had encouraged her love of numbers and logic. Her mother, who ran the local library, had fed her endless appetite for knowledge with books on everything from quantum physics to Renaissance art. They had created a sanctuary of learning in their modest home, nurturing her dreams, even when they stretched far beyond the town limits. The memories of home brought a bittersweet smile to her face as she approached the towering glass and steel structure that housed Vespa Industries. The building seemed to pierce the very sky, its reflective surfaces throwing back distorted images of the city below. This was it, the company that had revolutionized artificial intelligence and machine learning over the past decade. And at its helm was Johannes Vesper, the wunderkind CEO, whose name had become synonymous with innovation. Rees had studied everything she could find about both the company and its enigmatic leader. Vesper Industries' ethical AI frameworks were legendary in the tech world, and their commitment to responsible innovation aligned perfectly with her own values. The position she was interviewing for, lead AI ethics researcher, felt like it had been created specifically for her. The security guard at the desk, an older gentleman with kind eyes, checked her ID and handed her a visitor's badge. "Good luck, Miss Holden," he said with a warm smile that reminded her of her grandfather. She thanked him, trying to quell the butterflies that had taken up residence in her stomach. The elevator ride to the 47th floor gave her time to center herself. She pulled out her small notebook, reviewing her notes on the company's recent projects and the ideas she had developed for improving their algorithmic bias detection systems. Her fingers brushed against the worn edges of the pages, each one filled with careful observations and innovative solutions she hoped would impress the interview panel. When the elevator doors opened onto Vesper Industries' main floor, Rees stepped into what felt like the future itself. The space was open and airy, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of the city. Clusters of engineers and developers huddled around holographic displays, their animated discussions creating a buzz of creative energy. The walls were adorned with elegant, abstract art pieces that seemed to capture the essence of digital innovation in curves and colors. A young woman with a tablet approached her. "Ms. Holden, I'm Madison, Mr. Vesper's assistant. We're ready for you a bit early, if that's all right." Her friendly smile helped ease some of Rees's nervous tension. As she followed Madison through the office, Rees couldn't help but notice the diversity of the workforce. People of all backgrounds worked side by side, their differences celebrated rather than merely tolerated. It was another point in the company's favor. They didn't just talk about inclusion, they lived it. Madison led her to a conference room with views of Central Park stretching out like a green oasis amid the urban landscape. "Mr. Vesper will be joining us shortly," she explained, offering Rees water or coffee. "Would you like a few minutes to prepare?" Rees declined the beverages, but accepted the moment of solitude. As she stood by the window, gazing out at the city that never seemed to sleep, she felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged, not despite her background, but because of it. Her unique perspective, shaped by life in a small southern town and honed by years of academic excellence, was exactly what this urban tech giant needed. She heard the door open behind her and turned, expecting to see Madison or perhaps one of the technical interviewers. Instead, she found herself face to face with Johannes Vesper himself. The photos she had seen hadn't done him justice. Tall and commanding, with intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through her, he radiated an energy that transformed the entire room. "Ms. Holden," he said, extending his hand, "I hope you'll forgive me for starting early. When I read your proposal on ethical AI frameworks, I couldn't wait to discuss it further." His grip was firm, but not overwhelming. His smile genuine rather than practiced. Rees felt something shift in the atmosphere, like the moment before a summer storm breaks over Georgia pine forests. As she took her seat across from him, she had no way of knowing that this interview would change not just her career, but the entire course of her life. "Now," Johannes said, placing her resume on the table between them, "tell me more about your ideas for incorporating cultural context into AI decision-making processes. Your approach is unlike anything we've seen before." Rees took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and began to speak. The words flowed naturally, her passion for the subject evident in every sentence. She didn't notice how Giovannis leaned forward slightly, captivated not just by her ideas, but by the brilliant light that seemed to emanate from within her as she spoke. The morning sun continued its journey across the Manhattan sky, casting ever-changing patterns through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Neither of them realized that this moment, this perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, would become the first page of their extraordinary story. In the years to come, they would both look back on this day and recognize it for what it was. Not just a job interview, but destiny disguised as coincidence. As Reese outlined her vision for the future of ethical AI, her voice strong and clear in the pristine conference room, the city below continued its eternal dance of commerce and dreams. And somewhere, in the vast tapestry of time and chance, the threads of two lives began to intertwine in ways that neither science nor logic could have predicted. The chapter of her life that had begun in the red clay fields of Georgia was ending, and a new one was beginning here, in the glass and steel canyons of Manhattan. But some things would remain constant: her determination, her integrity, and her unwavering belief that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. These were the qualities that would not only land her the job, but eventually capture the heart of the man sitting across from her, though neither of them could have guessed it in that moment. As she concluded her presentation, Reese felt a subtle shift in the energy of the room. Giovannis was looking at her not just with professional interest, but with something deeper, something that would take both of them months to understand, and even longer to acknowledge. But for now, they were simply interviewer and candidate, two professionals discussing the future of technology, while destiny quietly wrote the first lines of their story in the morning light of a Manhattan spring day. Chapter 2. The First Encounter. Giovannis Vesper had conducted countless interviews throughout his career, each one following a carefully crafted script designed to identify the brightest minds in tech. But as he sat in his corner office later that evening, watching the sun paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of purple and gold, he couldn't stop thinking about how thoroughly Reese Holden had disrupted his routine. The light from his desk lamp cast a warm glow across the stack of resumes he'd reviewed that day. Hers sat on top, the crisp paper bearing impressive credentials that only told half the story. What the resume couldn't capture was the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about ethical AI implementation, or how her hands moved gracefully as she sketched out complex algorithms on the whiteboard. He pulled up the security footage from the lobby on his tablet, a habit he'd developed to study candidates' behavior when they thought no one was watching. There she was, arriving early, exchanging warm words with Arthur, the security guard. Most executives barely acknowledged the man's existence, but Reese had taken the time to learn his name, to share a genuine smile. Running his fingers through his dark hair, Giovannis realized he'd been studying the footage for longer than necessary. At 34, he'd built Vesper Industries through disciplined focus and unwavering dedication. Romance had never been part of the equation. His last relationship had ended 2 years ago when his girlfriend grew tired of competing with his company for attention. Since then, he'd convinced himself that personal entanglements would only complicate his vision for the future. But there was something different about Reese Holden. It wasn't just her beauty, though. That was undeniable. Her warm brown skin seemed to glow from within, and those eyes, intelligent, challenging, yet somehow gentle, had seen right through his carefully constructed professional facade. The next morning, Giovannis arrived earlier than usual, something stirring in his chest as he entered the building. He told himself he was just eager to review the quarterly reports, but his eyes kept drifting to the clock. The HR department wouldn't make their hiring decision for at least another week, following standard protocol. For the first time in years, he considered bypassing the usual procedures. Madison appeared in his doorway, tablet in hand. "Sir, the board members are waiting in the conference room for the morning briefing." He nodded, gathering his thoughts. Madison, about yesterday's AI ethics researcher interviews. Ms. Holden's interview. The hiring committee was very impressed. They're planning to schedule second-round interviews for next week. Cancel them, he said, surprising himself with the decisiveness in his voice. Send her an offer letter today, full benefits, signing bonus, and... He paused, considering. Set up her office on this floor. Madison's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd been with him long enough to know this was unusual. The AI ethics department is on 32, sir. I know. But this position will require frequent collaboration with executive leadership. The excuse sounded hollow, even to his ears, but Madison simply nodded and made a note on her tablet. The morning briefing dragged on endlessly. Giovannis found himself sketching complex neural network patterns in his notebook, similar to the ones Reese had described during her interview. Her innovative approach to reducing algorithmic bias had been brilliant, incorporating cultural context markers into the base code itself, rather than trying to correct for bias after the fact. By afternoon, he'd received confirmation that Reese had accepted the position. She would start in 2 weeks. Giovanni spent an embarrassing amount of time reorganizing his calendar to ensure he'd be in the office for her first day. The intervening weeks passed with excruciating slowness. Giovannis threw himself into work, overseeing the launch of 3 new projects and finalizing the acquisition of a promising startup. But his thoughts kept drifting to the way Reese had challenged his assumptions during the interview, how she'd stood her ground when defending her ideas. Finally, the morning of her first day arrived. Giovannis had already been in the office for 2 hours, reviewing her paperwork for the 4th time, when Madison announced her arrival. He waited 5 minutes, an eternity, before casually making his way to the floor's common area, where new employees typically gathered for orientation. Reese stood by the window, the morning light creating a halo around her elegant frame. She wore a deep purple dress that complemented her skin tone perfectly, with a tailored blazer that spoke of professional confidence. Several other employees had gathered around her, already drawn to her natural warmth and charisma. "Ms. Holden," he said, approaching the group, "welcome to Vesper Industries." She turned, and for a moment their eyes met. Something electric passed between them, making his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with his morning coffee. "Mr. Vesper," she replied, her voice carrying that hint of southern warmth that had haunted his thoughts. "Thank you for this opportunity." He gave her a brief tour of the office himself, ignoring Madison's pointed looks. As they walked, he found himself sharing more than just company protocols. He told her about his vision for ethical AI development, his hopes for creating technology that would genuinely improve lives rather than just generate profits. Reese listened intently, asking questions that demonstrated not only her technical expertise, but also a deep understanding of the human implications of their work. When she spoke about her own experiences with algorithmic bias and her ideas for addressing it, Giovannis found himself leaning in, drawn not just to her words, but to the passion behind them. They ended the tour at her new office, a corner space with views of both the Empire State Building and Central Park. "This is incredible," she said, running her hand along the sleek desk. "But isn't this floor usually reserved for executive leadership?" "We believe in keeping our best minds close," he replied smoothly, though his heart was racing at her proximity. "Your work will be instrumental in shaping the future of this company." She met his gaze with a hint of skepticism in her eyes. "I appreciate the vote of confidence, Mr. Vesper, but I prefer to earn my place through merit rather than assumption." Her directness caught him off guard. Most employees simply accepted his decisions without question. "I've reviewed your work extensively, Ms. Holden. Your place here has already been earned." He hesitated, then added, "And please, call me Giovannis." "Then you should call me Reese," she replied with a small smile that would occupy his thoughts for the rest of the day. Over the next few weeks, Giovannis found himself creating increasingly elaborate reasons to seek her input on projects. He scheduled weekly meetings to discuss her progress, which somehow always ran over their allocated time. They developed a habit of working late, ordering dinner from the same Thai place around the corner, spreading documents across the conference room table as the city lights twinkled below. During these evening sessions, he learned more about her background, how she'd grown up in a small Georgia town, daughter of educators who had fostered her love of learning. She told him about coding her first program on a second-hand laptop, about the challenges she'd faced as a black woman in tech, about her dreams of creating AI systems that would truly serve all of humanity. In turn, he found himself sharing things he rarely discussed: his Hungarian parents' immigration story, the pressure of being a first-generation American, the lonely nights spent building his company while his peers were building families. Something about Reese made him want to be more than just the successful CEO. It made him want to be understood. One evening, as they reviewed the latest algorithmic test results, their hands brushed, reaching for the same document. The contact was brief but electric, sending a jolt through his system that no amount of coffee could replicate. When he looked up, he found Reese watching him with an unreadable expression. "We should probably call it a night," she said softly, gathering her papers. "It's getting late." Giovannis wanted to protest, to find some reason to extend their time together, but he knew she was right. As he watched her walk toward the elevator, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, he realized with startling clarity that he was in danger of falling for her completely. Later that night, in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Giovannis poured himself a glass of his father's favorite Hungarian wine. The city sprawled below him, a glittering tapestry of lights and possibilities, but all he could think about was the way Reese's eyes crinkled when she smiled, how her laugh seemed to fill empty spaces he hadn't known existed in his life. He was playing a dangerous game, he knew. Office romances were complicated enough without the added complexity of their positions in the company. But for the first time in his life, Giovannis Vespa found himself willing to risk everything for something that spreadsheets and algorithms couldn't quantify. As he stood at his window, watching the city that never sleeps, he made a decision. He would take things slow, be professional, get to know her properly. But something told him that Reese Holden was worth any risk, worth upending every carefully laid plan he'd ever made. The wine in his glass caught the light, rich and deep, like the color of her eyes. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask her to lunch, somewhere away from the office, somewhere they could just be Giovannis and Reese, not CEO and employee. Whether she accepted or not would set the course for everything that followed. With that thought, he turned from the window and toward his home office, where he spent the next several hours reviewing her latest proposal for improving their AI systems. If anyone noticed that his comments on her work were more extensive and thoughtful than usual, they didn't mention it. And if he smiled every time he came across a particularly elegant solution in her code, well, that was nobody's business but his own. Chapter 3. Professional boundaries. The New York summer arrived with a vengeance, turning the city streets into heat-shimmering canyons of concrete and steel. Inside Vespa Industries, the climate control kept everything perfectly temperate, but Reese Holden could feel a different kind of heat building, one that no amount of air conditioning could dispel. 3 months into her position as lead AI ethics researcher, she had already revolutionized several of the company's core algorithms. Her office walls were covered with complex flowcharts and mathematical proofs, each one representing another step toward more equitable artificial intelligence. But lately, she found herself distracted by the way Giovannis's cologne would linger in her office after their meetings, how his presence seemed to charge the air with electricity. One particularly sweltering Wednesday morning, Reese arrived early to prepare for a crucial presentation to the board. The sun had barely risen over Manhattan when she stepped out of the elevator, only to find Giovannis already there, his suit jacket draped over a chair as he studied her latest proposal on the conference room's digital display. "You're here early," she said, trying to ignore how the morning light softened his usually sharp features. He turned, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "I wanted to review your findings before the board meeting. Your work on cultural context integration is remarkable." The praise warmed her, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Thank you, but it's really the team's work. Marcus and Priya have been instrumental in developing the new frameworks." Giovannis moved closer, pointing to a particular section of her presentation. "This part here, about incorporating diverse linguistic patterns into the base code, that's all you, Reese. I remember you mentioning this concept in your interview." The mention of their first meeting hung in the air between them. Reese busied herself with arranging her notes, trying not to remember how his eyes had lit up that day when she'd challenged his assumptions about AI development. Their morning routine had become a delicate dance of professional collaboration and carefully maintained boundaries. She'd notice him watching her during meetings, his gaze intense when she spoke about her passion for ethical technology. He'd find reasons to stop by her office, their discussions about algorithms inevitably drifting into more personal territory. The board meeting that morning was a triumph. Reese presented her findings with confidence, her voice strong as she explained how their new ethical frameworks could transform the industry. She felt Giovannis's eyes on her throughout the presentation, but kept her focus on the board members, answering their questions with precision and insight. Afterward, as the board members filed out with murmurs of approval, Giovannis approached her. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said quietly, "to celebrate your success." Reese's heart thundered in her chest, but her voice remained steady. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Vesper." The formality of his surname seemed to pain him. "It would be a professional dinner, of course, to discuss the project's next phase." She gathered her materials, buying time to steady her nerves. "We both know it wouldn't be just that." Her eyes met his, acknowledging the unspoken tension between them. "I've worked too hard to have my achievements overshadowed by office gossip." Something flickered in his expression. Respect, frustration, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. "You're right, of course," he said finally. "Your work should speak for itself," but their professional interactions only grew more charged after that. In team meetings, Reese would feel his presence behind her like a physical touch. When they worked late, their fingers would brush accidentally over shared documents, sending electricity through her system. She began timing her coffee breaks to avoid running into him in the break room, knowing that casual conversations inevitably turned into hour-long discussions that left her questioning her resolve. One evening, as storm clouds gathered over Manhattan, Reese found herself alone with Giovannis in the elevator. A crack of thunder made her jump slightly, and he instinctively reached out to steady her. His hand on her arm was warm, solid, and entirely too difficult to ignore. "Are you afraid of storms?" he asked softly. "No," she replied, moving slightly away. "They remind me of home." Summer thunderstorms in Georgia were practically a daily occurrence. "Tell me about your home," he said, and something in his voice made her look up. The elevator's soft lighting cast shadows across his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. Before she could respond, the doors opened to their floor, and reality rushed back in. "Another time, perhaps," she said, stepping out quickly. "I have a deadline to meet." That night, working late in her office, Reese found herself staring at the city through rain-streaked windows. The storm had intensified, turning Manhattan into a blur of neon reflections and shadow. She thought about Giovannis, probably still in his office down the hall, and all the reasons why giving in to their attraction would be a mistake. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Baby girl, you're working too hard. Don't forget to live a little." Reese smiled at her mother's uncanny timing. Sophia Holden had always seemed to know exactly when her daughter needed guidance, but this situation was more complicated than any she'd faced before. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Giovannis stood there, holding 2 cups of her favorite Ethiopian coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, offering her one. "The storm doesn't look like it's letting up anytime soon." She accepted the coffee, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Thank you. You didn't have to stay late just to bring me coffee." "I stayed late because I wanted to show you something." He moved to her computer, pulling up a new project file. "I've been working on implementing your cultural context algorithms in our healthcare AI division. The preliminary results are fascinating." For the next hour, they lost themselves in code and possibility, the storm raging outside forgotten. Reese found herself drawn not just to his brilliant mind, but to the way he truly listened to her ideas, how he built upon them with insights of his own. When they finally surfaced from their work, she realized how close they were standing. She could smell his cologne, see the slight shadow of stubble on his jaw. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Reese," he said softly, her name like a prayer on his lips. She stepped back, putting her desk between them. "We can't, Giovannis. You know we can't." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as frustration. "Why not?" "Because I'm the CEO? Because it might complicate things? Because I've spent my entire career fighting to be taken seriously," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. "Because every achievement, every breakthrough would be questioned. People would assume I earned my position through something other than merit." "Anyone who knows your work would never think that," he argued, but she could see in his eyes that he understood. "It's not about what people think," she said softly. "It's about what I know I'm capable of. I need to prove that to myself, without any complications." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Giovannis nodded. "I respect that," he said. "But I hope you know that my interest in you has everything to do with your brilliant mind and incredible spirit, and nothing to do with your position in this company." After he left, Reese stayed in her office until the storm passed, watching the city lights emerge from the rain. She thought about the way her heart raced whenever he was near, about the dreams she'd fought so hard to achieve, about the fine line between professional success and personal happiness. Her computer screen still displayed their shared work, lines of code that represented hours of collaboration. She'd never met anyone who understood her vision for ethical technology the way Giovannis did. Their minds seemed to operate on the same wavelength, finishing each other's thoughts and building on each other's ideas. But that intellectual compatibility was part of what made their situation so dangerous. How could she be sure her professional achievements would be viewed, independently of their personal connection? How could she maintain objectivity when every interaction left her wanting more? As she finally gathered her things to leave, Reese caught her reflection in the window. The woman who looked back at her was stronger than she'd ever been, standing on the cusp of revolutionary developments in AI ethics. She couldn't risk everything she'd worked for, no matter how compelling the temptation. The next morning, she arrived early as usual, only to find a small package on her desk. Inside was a book on Hungarian folklore, something she'd mentioned wanting to read weeks ago during one of their late-night discussions. The note simply read, "Your mind is extraordinary. Everything else can wait." J. Reese traced her fingers over his handwriting, then carefully placed the book in her drawer. She had work to do, boundaries to maintain, and a reputation to build. But as she immersed herself in code and algorithms, she couldn't help but wonder if there might be a way to have both professional success and personal fulfillment. For now, though, she would focus on what she could control: her work, her integrity, and the careful distance she maintained from the man whose every glance threatened to upend her carefully constructed world. Chapter 4. The Conference. The Boston Tech Innovation Summit was the most prestigious gathering in the industry, transforming the historic Fairmont Copley Plaza into a nexus of cutting-edge technology and brilliant minds. For Reese, it represented an opportunity to present her groundbreaking work on ethical AI to the wider tech community. For Jovanis, it meant 3 days of watching her shine while maintaining a professional distance that grew more difficult by the hour. Snow fell softly outside the hotel's ornate windows as Reese checked in, her carry-on rolling quietly across the marble floor. The lobby's crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the space, their sparkle reminiscent of the Manhattan skyline she'd left behind. She was reaching for her room key when a familiar voice made her heart skip. "Ms. Holden," Jovanis said, approaching from the direction of the hotel bar. "I trust your flight was comfortable." She turned to find him looking more casual than she'd ever seen him. His suit jacket draped over one arm, the top button of his shirt undone. "Mr. Vesper," she replied, noting how the informal setting seemed to soften the edges of their usual professional dynamic. "The flight was fine, thank you." "Please, we're away from the office. It's Jovanis." His smile held a warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fireplace in the lobby. "Would you join me for dinner?" "The hotel's restaurant is supposed to be excellent, and we should discuss tomorrow's keynote." Reese hesitated. Away from the glass walls of Vesper Industries, their usual boundaries felt less defined, but her presentation was tomorrow, and going over the details one last time couldn't hurt. "Give me 30 minutes to freshen up." His eyes lit up with poorly concealed pleasure. "I'll make a reservation." In her room, Reese changed into a deep burgundy dress that she'd packed for the conference's closing gala. The fabric hugged her curves while maintaining professional elegance, and the color made her skin glow. She told herself she wasn't dressing for him, but the extra time she spent arranging her hair suggested otherwise. The hotel's restaurant was a study in old-world luxury, with dark wood panels and intimate lighting. Jovanis was waiting at a corner table, and the way his eyes tracked her approach made her glad she'd chosen the burgundy dress. "You look stunning," he said as she sat down, then quickly added, "though I'm sure the tech community will be more interested in your groundbreaking research." Reese smiled, appreciating his attempt to maintain professional courtesy. "The research is what matters, though I won't pretend I don't want to make a good impression tomorrow." They ordered wine, a Hungarian red that Jovanis recommended, and as they waited for their meals, the conversation flowed easily from work to more personal territory. Away from the office, without the constant reminder of their professional roles, Reese found herself relaxing into his company. "Tell me about your family," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "You've mentioned your parents immigrated from Hungary, but you've never said much more." Jovanis's expression softened. "They came here with nothing but dreams and determination. My father was a professor in Budapest, but here he worked as a janitor while learning English. My mother taught piano lessons from our tiny apartment." He paused, lost in memory. "They sacrificed everything to give me an education." "Is that why you push yourself so hard?" Reese asked softly. He met her eyes across the table. "Partly, but lately I've been wondering if there's more to life than just working to prove something." The intensity of his gaze made her heart race. She changed the subject to safer territory, asking about his plans for the company's future, but the moment lingered between them like the wine's rich aftertaste. After dinner, they found themselves reluctant to part ways. The hotel's grand lobby was quiet, most conference attendees having retired early before tomorrow's events. Snow continued to fall outside the tall windows, creating an intimate atmosphere that made the rest of the world feel very far away. "Would you like to review your presentation one more time?" Giovannis asked, though they both knew she was more than prepared. "Actually," Reese said, surprising herself, "I'd rather hear more about Budapest. You light up when you talk about it." They settled into a pair of high-backed chairs near the fireplace, and Giovannis began sharing stories of his childhood visits to his grandparents' home in the hills of Buda. He described the view of the Danube at sunset, the smell of his grandmother's cooking, the sound of church bells echoing across the city. "You should see it," he said softly. "There's this little cafe near the castle district where the pastries are like nothing you've ever tasted." "Are you offering to be my tour guide?" Reese asked, trying to keep her tone light, despite the way her pulse quickened at the implied invitation. "Would you say yes if I was?" Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a message from the conference organizers about tomorrow's schedule. Reality crashed back in, reminding her of all the reasons why this, whatever this was, couldn't happen. "I should get some rest," she said, standing perhaps too quickly. "Tomorrow's a big day." Giovannis rose as well, concern crossing his features. "Reese, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," she assured him, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "I just need to focus on the presentation right now. Everything else—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish that thought. "Everything else can wait," he completed for her, echoing the note he'd left with the Book of Hungarian Folklore weeks ago. She nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Good night, Giovannis." "Good night, Reese. You're going to be brilliant tomorrow." In her room, Reese tried to focus on reviewing her slides one last time, but her mind kept drifting to the way Giovannis had looked in the firelight, how his voice had softened when he spoke of his homeland. The professional boundaries she'd worked so hard to maintain felt increasingly like arbitrary lines drawn in sand, slowly being erased by the tide of their growing connection. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow making Boston look like a scene from a postcard. Reese arrived at the conference center early, her presentation ready, her mind focused. When she took the stage, she saw Giovannis in the front row, his presence both comforting and distracting. Her presentation was a triumph. She spoke with passion and authority about the importance of ethical AI development, her innovative solutions drawing enthusiastic responses from the audience. During the Q&A session, she handled even the most challenging questions with grace and insight. Afterward, as colleagues and competitors alike crowded around to congratulate her, she caught glimpses of Giovannis, watching from a distance, pride evident in his expression. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and in that moment, something shifted between them. A recognition that what they shared went far beyond professional admiration. That evening, the conference hosted a cocktail reception in the hotel's grand ballroom. Reese found herself surrounded by industry leaders eager to discuss her work, but her awareness of Giovannis's presence never wavered. He moved through the crowd with easy charm, but she noticed how his gaze consistently found its way back to her. As the evening wore on, the crowd thinned, and soft jazz from the hotel's quartet replaced the earlier buzz of conversation. Reese stepped out onto the ballroom's terrace, needing a moment of quiet. The snow had stopped, leaving the city blanketed in white, the lights of Boston twinkling like stars fallen to earth. She heard the terrace door open behind her and knew without turning that it was Giovannis. He draped his jacket over her shoulders, the fabric warm from his body and carrying his familiar scent. "You were incredible today," he said, moving to stand beside her at the railing. "Though I knew you would be." "Thank you," she replied, pulling his jacket closer around her, "for believing in me from the beginning." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their breath mist in the cold air. The music from inside drifted out to them, a slow melody that seemed to match the gentle fall of snowflakes that had begun again. "Dance with me?" Giovannis asked softly. Reese turned to look at him, finding vulnerability in his expression that she'd never seen before. "Here," he confirmed, "where we're just Reese and Giovanni's, not CEO and employee, just two people in the snow." She should have said no, should have maintained the professional distance that had served her so well. Instead, she stepped into his arms, letting him draw her close as they swayed to the distant music. His hand was warm against her back, his cheek brushing her temple. They moved together, as if they'd done this 100 times before, finding a rhythm as natural as their intellectual connections had been from the start. "This changes everything," she whispered, both a warning and a recognition. "Maybe everything needed to change," he replied, his voice low and intimate in the space between them. The snow fell silently around them, each flake carrying possibilities neither of them had dared to consider before this moment. Tomorrow they would return to Manhattan, to their roles and responsibilities, to the complex reality of their professional relationship. But for now, they allowed themselves this dance, this moment of perfect understanding beneath the Boston stars. Chapter 5. Pursuit Manhattan in spring bore little resemblance to that snowy night in Boston, but Giovannis found himself thinking of their dance whenever he caught the scent of fresh flowers from the vendor outside Vesper Industries. The memory of Reese in his arms, snowflakes catching in her hair, haunted him through endless meetings and late-night strategy sessions. Their return from the conference had brought with it a subtle shift in their dynamic. The professional boundaries remained, but there was an undercurrent now, an electricity that charged even their most mundane interactions. Giovannis found himself planning his pursuit of Reese with the same careful attention he'd once reserved for corporate acquisitions. It began with small gestures. Every morning, her favorite Ethiopian coffee would appear on her desk, steam rising from the artisanal ceramic mug he'd had specially made for her. The mug bore an intricate design combining traditional African patterns with Hungarian folk art motifs, a fusion of their heritage that hadn't gone unnoticed. "You don't have to do this," Reese said one morning, finding him placing the coffee on her desk. "I know," he replied, letting his fingers linger on the mug. "I want to." He arranged for her to speak at prestigious tech conferences, ensuring her groundbreaking work received the recognition it deserved. When she revolutionized their AI's cultural sensitivity algorithms, he made sure the press releases prominently featured her name and contributions. "You're building quite a reputation in the industry," he commented one evening as they reviewed the latest coverage of her innovations. Reese looked up from her tablet, her eyes sharp. "Is that what this is about? Proving that my success isn't tied to our connection?" "This is about making sure everyone sees what I saw the moment you walked into my office," he said softly. "A brilliant mind that's going to change the world." She held his gaze for a long moment before returning to her work, but he noticed the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. As spring deepened into summer, Giovannis found more creative ways to demonstrate his interest while respecting her professional boundaries. He started a book club within the company, knowing her love of literature. Their discussions of novels often turned into deep conversations about ethics, technology, and the future of humanity. During one particularly heated debate about the moral implications of artificial consciousness, Giovannis found himself mesmerized by the passion in her voice, the way her hands moved as she argued her point. The other employees had long since left, but they remained in the conference room, lost in their exchange of ideas. "You keep looking at me like that," Reese said finally, gathering her notes. "Like what?" "Like you're seeing something more than just another employee." "I've never seen you as just another employee, Reese," he admitted. "From the first day, you've been extraordinary." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "That's what concerns me." Before she could leave, he spoke again. "Have dinner with me tomorrow. Not here, not as colleagues. Let me take you to this little Hungarian restaurant in the village. The owner reminds me of my grandmother." Reese paused at the door. "Giovannis." "One dinner," he pressed. "If you can look me in the eye afterward and tell me this isn't worth exploring, I'll never mention it again." The next evening, Giovannis found himself more nervous than he'd been before any board meeting or product launch. He'd chosen his outfit carefully, a charcoal suit that spoke of sophistication without the rigid formality of his usual business attire. The restaurant was intimate, with exposed brick walls and candlelight that cast warm shadows. When Reese arrived, wearing a dress the color of midnight, Giovannis forgot every carefully prepared comment he'd planned. "You look," he started. "Professional," she suggested with a slight smile. "Beautiful," he finished. "Though you're always beautiful, even when you're arguing about algorithm bias at 3 in the morning." Their table was in a quiet corner, surrounded by the soft murmur of Hungarian conversation and the rich aroma of paprika and home cooking. As they settled in, an elderly woman approached, her face creasing with joy at the sight of Giovannis. "Giovannis Dragam," she exclaimed, pulling him into a warm embrace. "It's been too long." "Magda Neni," he replied affectionately. "This is Reese. I wanted her to taste real Hungarian cooking." Magda turned to Reese, studying her with knowing eyes. "Ah, this is the one you spoke of. Yes, I see why now. Such intelligence in those eyes." She patted Reese's hand. "Don't worry, Kedvis. He's a good boy beneath all that business success. His grandmother and I were friends in the old country." As Magda bustled away to prepare their meal personally, Reese raised an eyebrow. "You spoke of me." Giovannis felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Magda Neni has a way of drawing out confidences. Something about her reminds me of home." The evening unfolded like a dream, with course after course of traditional Hungarian dishes appearing at their table. Giovannis watched Reese's delight as she tasted each new flavor, explaining the stories behind each dish, sharing pieces of his heritage. "My mother used to make these exact turogombok when I was sick," he said, watching Reese sample the sweet cottage cheese dumplings. "She said they could cure anything." "Tell me more about her," Reese encouraged, and soon Giovannis found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone at the company. About his mother's determination to maintain Hungarian traditions in their tiny New York apartment, about the sacrifices his parents had made to give him an education. In turn, Reese opened up about her own family, about growing up in Georgia, where her parents had instilled in her a love of learning and a determination to succeed despite any obstacles. As she spoke about her father's influence on her career choice, Giovannis noticed how her whole face lit up. "He always said that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around," she explained. "That's why your company's ethical approach resonated with me so much." "Is that the only thing that resonated with you?" Giovannis asked softly. Reese met his eyes across the candlelight. "You know it wasn't." After dinner, neither wanted the evening to end. They walked through Washington Square Park, the spring night warm and full of possibility. Street musicians played somewhere in the distance, their music carrying on the gentle breeze. "Thank you for tonight," Reese said as they paused by the fountain, "for sharing your world with me." "I want to share everything with you," Giovannis replied, taking her hand. "Not just dinner, not just work, everything." She looked down at their joined hands. "You know why this is complicated." I know why you think it's complicated, he corrected, but I also know that what we have, this connection, this understanding, it's rare. And I'm willing to work as hard at earning your trust as I did at building my company. And if it doesn't work out, she asked, if we try this and it falls apart, then we deal with it as the professionals we are, he said. But Reese, I'm more afraid of not trying at all, of letting fear keep us from something extraordinary. She studied his face in the moonlight, and he could see her brilliant mind working through every possibility, every potential outcome. Finally, she squeezed his hand. Slowly, she said. If we do this, we take it slowly, and we keep it private until we're sure. Giovannis felt his heart soar, but he kept his voice steady. I can work with that. As they walked back through the city streets, their hands still linked, Giovannis found himself planning their future with the same intensity he usually reserved for business strategies. But this was more important than any corporate merger or product launch. This was about building something real with a woman who challenged and inspired him in equal measure. The next morning, when Reese arrived at her office, she found a single red rose on her desk along with her usual coffee. The note simply read, "Slowly, but surely, Jay." She tucked the note into her drawer with a smile, then dove into her work with renewed energy. If anyone noticed the change in their dynamic, the lingering glances, the soft smiles they shared in meetings, they were professional enough not to mention it. And so began their careful dance, a delicate balance of professional excellence and growing personal connection. Giovannis pursued Reese with patience and determination, each gesture thoughtfully chosen to show her that his interest went far beyond physical attraction or professional admiration. He was pursuing her mind, her heart, her soul, and he was prepared to take all the time she needed to prove that their connection was worth any risk it might entail. Chapter 6. The Wall. The New York autumn painted Central Park in shades of gold and crimson, but Reese barely noticed the changing seasons as she buried herself in work. Despite their agreement to explore their connection slowly, her growing feelings for Giovannis terrified her. Every shared smile, every brush of hands over project documents, every late-night conversation that strayed from professional topics to personal dreams, it all added up to something that threatened everything she'd worked for. The breaking point came during a late-night project session. They were alone in the office, the Manhattan skyline twinkling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The AI ethics report they were supposed to be reviewing lay forgotten between them as their discussion drifted to more personal territory. "Tell me more about your time at MIT," Giovannis said, his voice soft in the quiet office. "What made you choose artificial intelligence as your focus?" Reese leaned back in her chair, memories flooding back. "There was this professor in my freshman year. She was the only black woman in the department, and she took me under her wing. She showed me how AI could either perpetuate societal biases or help eliminate them. It all depended on who was writing the code." "She sounds remarkable," Giovannis observed, his eyes never leaving her face. "She was. Still is. She taught me that being different wasn't a weakness. It was my superpower, my perspective, my experiences. They gave me insights others might miss." Reese smiled at the memory. "She used to say that technology was like a mirror. It reflects back the biases of its creators unless we consciously work to make it better." "That's what you're doing here," Giovannis said, moving closer. "Making it better, making all of us better." The intensity in his gaze made her heart race. They were sitting too close now, the late hour and shared confidences, creating an intimacy that was becoming harder to resist. "Giovannis," she said softly, "we need to talk about this, about us." He reached for her hand, his touch sending electricity through her system. "I'm in love with you, Reese. I think I have been since that first interview when you challenged every assumption I had about AI development." The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and dangerous. Reese pulled her hand away, standing to put distance between them. "You can't say things like that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're the CEO. I'm an employee. Do you have any idea what people would say?" "I don't care what people say," he replied, rising to follow her. "I care about what's real. And this, us, it's the most real thing I've ever felt." "That's easy for you to say," Reese countered, wrapping her arms around herself. "You're Giovannis Vesper. You've already proven yourself. But I'm still establishing my reputation in this industry. Do you know how hard I've worked to be taken seriously as a black woman in tech?" She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Every achievement, every breakthrough, they'd all be questioned. People would assume I got where I am because I'm sleeping with the boss, not because of my mind or my work. "Anyone who knows your work would never think that," Giovannis argued, but she could see the understanding dawning in his eyes. "It doesn't matter what they think. It matters what I know about myself. I've spent my entire life proving I belong in these spaces. I can't risk everything I've built for a relationship that might not even work." "So you've already decided it won't work?" His voice held a note of hurt she'd never heard before. "I've decided I'm not interested in being anyone's secret or temporary distraction," she said firmly. "I've worked too hard to be reduced to that." "Is that what you think this is?" Giovanni stepped closer, his expression intense. "A distraction?" "Reese, you're the most brilliant person I've ever met. Your mind challenges me. Your integrity inspires me. Your passion for making the world better makes me want to be better. This isn't some office romance or passing attraction." Reese felt her resolve wavering under the sincerity in his voice, but she steeled herself. "Then prove it," she said quietly. "Prove that this is more than just words, because right now all I see is risk. Risk to my career, my reputation, everything I've worked for." "Tell me how," he said. "Tell me what you need from me to prove this is real." She shook her head, gathering her things. "That's not how this works. I need to focus on my career right now, on the projects we're developing, on making a real difference in how AI impacts people's lives." "We can have both," Giovannis insisted. "Professional success and personal happiness aren't mutually exclusive." "Maybe not for you," she replied, "but I had to fight twice as hard to get half as far. I can't afford any distractions right now." The word distraction hit him like a physical blow. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Is that all I am to you, a distraction?" "No," she admitted softly. "That's what makes this so difficult." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words and unfulfilled possibilities. Finally, Giovannis spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "I respect your decision," he said, "but I want you to know that my feelings won't change. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll still be here." Reese gathered her remaining strength and professionalism. "Thank you for understanding. I should go home now. It's late." He nodded, watching as she collected her papers and laptop. At the door, she paused, looking back at him, standing alone in the dimly lit office. "Giovannis?" "Yes?" "I'm not saying never," she said quietly. "I'm just saying not now." After she left, Giovannis stood at the window for a long time, watching the city lights blur through eyes that burned with unshed tears. He understood her reasons, respected them even, but understanding didn't make the ache in his chest any less real. The next few weeks were an exercise in professional restraint. They maintained their working relationship, but the easy warmth of their interactions was replaced by careful formality. The coffee still appeared on her desk each morning, but now it came from her assistant rather than Giovannis himself. In meetings, they focused strictly on business matters, their previous intellectual sparring replaced by polite agreement and professional distance. The other employees noticed the change, but were wise enough not to comment. Reese threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, developing breakthrough after breakthrough in their AI ethics protocols. Her reputation in the industry grew stronger with each innovation, but the success felt hollow without being able to share it with the one person who truly understood her vision. Late one night, working alone in her office, she found herself staring at the book of Hungarian folklore still tucked away in her drawer. Her fingers traced his handwriting on the note, remembering all the moments they'd shared, all the possibilities they'd left unexplored. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. It was Madison, Giovannis's assistant, with a stack of papers requiring her signature. "He's not here," Madison said softly, noticing Reese's quick glance toward Giovannis's office. "He's been taking more business trips lately. Says it's good to check on our international operations personally." Reese nodded, trying to ignore the pang in her chest. She knew he was giving her the space she'd asked for, but his absence left an emptiness in the office that no amount of professional success could fill. As she signed the papers, Madison hesitated, then spoke again. "You know, I've worked for Mr. Vesper for 5 years. I've seen him date other women, seen him end relationships without a second thought, but I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." "Madison," Reese warned, not wanting to have this conversation. "I know it's not my place," the assistant continued, "but sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards." After Madison left, Reese sat in her quiet office, the city lights twinkling beyond her window. She thought about risks and rewards, about professional success and personal fulfillment, about all the walls she'd built to protect herself, and whether they were now keeping out something worth fighting for. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Baby girl, remember what I always told you. Your brain got you where you are, but don't let it talk you out of where you're meant to be." Reese smiled at her mother's uncanny timing and wisdom, but for now, she had to stay strong, had to prove to herself and the world that she could succeed on her own merits. The wall she'd built between herself and Giovannis would stay in place, protecting her heart and her career, even as it threatened to crumble with every shared glance and unspoken word. Chapter 7. Transformation. Winter descended on Manhattan with unusual ferocity, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the emptiness Giovannis felt in Reese's absence. Her words had struck deeper than she knew, forcing him to examine himself in ways he'd avoided for years. In the quiet of his penthouse, overlooking a city shrouded in snow, he began the painful process of transformation. The first step was acknowledging the truth in her fears. He spent a sleepless night, reviewing every past relationship, every casual encounter that had ended when things got too serious. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Fiam, you build walls with your success, just like your father did." His father, brilliant, driven, and ultimately alone despite his marriage. The parallel hit Giovannis like a physical blow. He'd been repeating the same pattern, using his work as a shield against real intimacy, until Reese. The next morning, he did something he hadn't done in years. He called a therapist. Dr. Elena Martinez specialized in helping executives navigate personal growth. Their first session was uncomfortable, forcing him to confront truths he'd buried beneath spreadsheets and business strategies. "Tell me about your parents' marriage," Dr. Martinez prompted, her office offering a view of snow falling over Central Park. Giovannis stared out the window, memories surfacing. "They loved each other once. I remember them dancing in our tiny apartment kitchen, my mother teaching my father American idioms while he cooked Hungarian dishes. But somewhere along the way, his drive for success consumed everything else, including their relationship. He provided for us, gave us everything he never had growing up, but he was never really there." Giovannis turned back to face her. "I swore I'd never be like that, but you're afraid you're becoming him." The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Reese sees it, he admitted. She sees everything. That's what terrifies me and attracts me. Over the following weeks, Giovannis threw himself into therapy with the same intensity he usually reserved for business deals. He explored his fear of vulnerability, his tendency to control outcomes, his habit of using success as a substitute for real connection. At work, he maintained a professional distance from Reese, respecting her boundaries while quietly working on himself. He noticed how she watched him sometimes, curiosity in her eyes as she observed the subtle changes in his behavior. The biggest test came during a crucial board meeting. One of the older board members dismissed Reese's concerns about algorithmic bias in their new healthcare AI, suggesting she was being oversensitive. The old Giovannis would have smoothed things over diplomatically. The new Giovanni stood up. "With all due respect, Richard," he said firmly, "Ms. Holden's expertise in this area is precisely why we hired her. Her perspective isn't oversensitive. It's essential. And if we're going to be industry leaders in ethical AI, we need to listen when she raises these concerns." The room fell silent. Reese's expression was unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes, recognition perhaps of the change in him. After the meeting, she caught up with him in the hallway. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "Not because of any personal feelings, but because it was right. You were right." She studied him for a long moment. "You're different lately." "I'm trying to be," he admitted. "Not for you, though you inspired it. For myself." That evening, alone in his office, Giovannis pulled out an old photo of his parents on their wedding day. They looked so young, so full of hope. Somewhere along the way, his father had lost sight of what really mattered, choosing the safety of success over the risk of real intimacy. "I won't make the same mistake," he whispered to the photograph. The therapy sessions continued, each one peeling back another layer of protection he'd built around his heart. Dr. Martinez helped him see how his drive for perfection had become a way to avoid genuine connection. "What are you really afraid of, Giovannis?" she asked during one particularly challenging session. "Failing," he answered automatically, then caught himself. "No, that's not quite true. I'm afraid of succeeding at the wrong things, of building an empire but losing what matters most." The revelation led him to make changes in how he ran his company. He implemented more family-friendly policies, encouraged work-life balance, and started mentoring young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. The press praised these initiatives as progressive corporate leadership, but few knew they stemmed from his personal journey of growth. One cold February morning, he arrived at the office to find Reese waiting by his desk. She held a newspaper featuring an article about Vespa Industries' new mentorship program for minority students in tech. "This is remarkable," she said softly, "and genuine. I can tell it's not just corporate PR." "It's something I should have done long ago," he replied. "Sometimes it takes someone special to help us see our blind spots." Their eyes met, and for a moment the professional masks slipped. Reese saw the changes in him, not just in his actions, but in his energy, his presence. The driven CEO was still there, but now tempered with something deeper, more authentic. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "Because you were right," he said simply, "about everything. About me needing to prove this was more than words. About the importance of earning trust through actions, not promises. About the need to be more than just successful, to be worthy." Reese's expression softened, but she maintained her professional composure. "The program will make a real difference for a lot of young people." "That's the goal," he replied, "to create something meaningful, something that lasts beyond quarterly reports and stock prices." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. I notice you're not pursuing me anymore, she said quietly. I'm pursuing something more important right now, he answered. The person I need to be, not just for you, but for myself. The smile she gave him then was worth every uncomfortable therapy session, every painful self-revelation, every moment of growth and change. Later that week, during a late-night coding session, their teams were working on integrating her ethical frameworks into the company's core AI systems. Giovannis brought coffee for everyone, not just Reese, and spent time listening to ideas from even the junior developers. One young programmer, clearly nervous about speaking up, suggested a modification to Reese's algorithm. Instead of dismissing the idea or trying to control the discussion, Giovannis encouraged the dialogue, watching with quiet pride as Reese built on the suggestion to create something even better. "You've changed," Madison commented later, bringing him the daily reports. "Had to happen eventually," he replied with a small smile. "It looks good on you," she said. "The whole office feels different, more human." That night, as snow fell outside his penthouse windows, Giovannis wrote a letter to his father. He didn't mail it. His father had passed away years ago, but the act of writing helped him understand his own journey better. "You taught me how to succeed," he wrote, "but Reese taught me how to grow. Success without growth is just another form of failure. I understand now why you were always chasing the next big deal, the next achievement. You were trying to fill something empty inside. But I've learned that real fulfillment doesn't come from what we achieve. It comes from who we become." The transformation wasn't easy or quick. There were days when old habits crept back, when the temptation to control and direct everything became almost overwhelming. But each time he remembered Reese's words about proving himself through actions, not words. Slowly, steadily, Giovannis Vesper was becoming the man he needed to be. Not just for Reese, but for himself, his company, and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Chapter 8. The night spring returned to Manhattan in a burst of cherry blossoms and renewed possibilities. Vesper Industries had just launched its groundbreaking ethical AI framework, a project that represented months of collaboration between Reese's team and Giovannis's leadership. The success was unprecedented, with tech giants and governments worldwide seeking to adopt their standards. The launch party was held in the company's renovated rooftop garden, a space that had been transformed under Giovannis's new initiative to create more sustainable communal workspaces. String lights twinkled overhead like stars, and the city spread out below them in a tapestry of lights and shadows. Reese stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Giovannis give his speech. He'd changed in the months since their confrontation, not just in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts that only someone who knew him well would notice. The aggressive drive for success had been replaced by something more measured, more genuine. "This success belongs to every member of our team," he was saying, his voice carrying across the rooftop. "But I want to especially acknowledge Dr. Reese Holden, whose brilliant mind and unwavering ethical standards have pushed us to be better, not just as a company, but as people." Their eyes met across the crowd, and Reese felt the familiar flutter in her chest. She'd watched his transformation from a distance, maintaining professional boundaries while quietly noting every change, every step forward. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Reese found herself lingering, drawn to the quiet energy of the spring night. She stood by the rooftop's edge, looking out over the city she'd come to love. "Penny for your thoughts." Giovannis's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him holding 2 glasses of champagne. His tie loosened slightly in the warm evening air. "Just thinking about how far we've come," she said, accepting one of the glasses. "The project, the company, everything." "You mean how far I've come?" he said with a gentle smile. "It's okay to say it. I know I needed to change." "We all change," she replied. The question is whether we change for the better." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker below. The spring breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from the rooftop garden, mixing with the familiar urban symphony of distant traffic and humming air conditioners. "Do you remember that night in Boston?" Giovannis asked suddenly. "When we danced in the snow?" Reese felt her heart skip. "Of course I do. I knew then that you would change my life," he said softly. "I just didn't understand how much." She turned to look at him, really look at him. The man before her was still Giovannis Vesper, brilliant CEO and visionary leader, but there was a depth to him now, a vulnerability that made him more human, more real. "Your therapy sessions," she said carefully. "They seem to be helping." He nodded. "Dr. Martinez helped me understand a lot about myself, about why I built walls with success just like my father did, about why real intimacy scared me more than any business challenge. And now," Reese asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "now I know that real strength isn't about control or success. It's about being brave enough to be vulnerable, to risk everything for what matters most." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. The rooftop was empty now except for them, the string lights casting a soft glow that made everything feel dreamlike. "Would you like to see something?" Giovannis asked, holding out his hand. Reese hesitated only a moment before taking it, letting him lead her through the rooftop garden to a door she'd never noticed before. It opened to his private office, not the formal one downstairs, but a smaller, more personal space with floor-to-ceiling windows and comfortable furniture. "I've been working on something," he said, moving to his desk and pulling out a leather-bound journal. "Every day since you challenged me to prove this was more than words, I've been writing. About my therapy insights, about the changes I wanted to make, about the man I wanted to become." He handed her the journal with slightly trembling hands. "I want you to read it, all of it, because you deserve to know that this transformation wasn't just about winning you back. It was about becoming someone worthy of the connection we share." Reese opened the journal, her fingers tracing his elegant handwriting. The entries were deeply personal, revealing a level of self-reflection and honesty that touched her heart. "April 15th, she read aloud. "Today in therapy we discussed my fear of ending up like my father, successful but alone. Reese saw this in me before I could see it myself. Her strength in maintaining boundaries forced me to confront my own weakness in avoiding real connection." She looked up to find him watching her with vulnerable eyes. "Giovannis." "Keep reading," he encouraged softly. As she turned the pages, she found entries about his changing approach to leadership, about the mentorship program he'd started, about late-night reflections on what really mattered in life. And woven through it all, like a golden thread, were his thoughts about her. Not just his feelings, but his deep respect for her integrity, her brilliance, her strength. "May 22nd, she read, her voice catching. Watched Reese present her ethical AI framework to the board today. Her passion for making technology serve humanity rather than control it reminds me of what really matters. I'm not just becoming a better man because I love her, I'm becoming better because she showed me what real integrity looks like." The journal slipped from her hands as emotion overwhelmed her. Giovannis caught it gently, setting it aside before taking her hands in his. "I know we said we'd take things slowly," he said softly, "and I'll wait as long as you need. But I want you to know that this journey of change, it's real, it's permanent. Whether or not you ever choose to be with me, I'll never go back to being the man I was before." Reese looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his words. When she looked up again, there were tears in her eyes. "Kiss me," she whispered. He hesitated, searching her face. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering, she reached up and drew his face down to hers. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like the first drops of rain after a long drought. Then something broke loose in both of them, and the kiss deepened into something passionate and real. Giovannis pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pressed against the small of her back. Reese wound her arms around his neck, losing herself in the sensation of finally letting go of the walls she'd built. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, the city lights seemed brighter somehow, the spring night warmer. Giovannis rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered. Reese knew they were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but looking at the man before her, this new version of Giovannis who had worked so hard to grow, to change, to become worthy of trust, she found she didn't want to go back. "Yes," she said simply. That night was about more than physical passion, though there was plenty of that. It was about trust finally given and earned, about walls coming down and hearts opening up. They took their time exploring each other, learning each other's rhythms and responses, building something beautiful and real in the quiet hours of the spring night. Afterward, lying in his arms as dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Reese felt no regret, no fear about what tomorrow might bring. She had seen the truth of his transformation in his actions, his words, and now in the tender way he held her. "What are you thinking?" he murmured into her hair. "That some risks are worth taking," she replied, snuggling closer, "that sometimes the hardest walls to break down are the ones we build ourselves." Giovannis kissed her temple softly. "We'll figure this out together," he promised. "Whatever challenges come, we'll face them as equals, as partners." As the sun rose over Manhattan, painting the room in golden light, they knew that everything had changed. But unlike the changes that had come before, this one felt right, felt true. It felt like coming home. Chapter 9. The Choice. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Giovannis's penthouse, painting the room in soft golden hues. Reese stirred awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came flooding back. The rooftop celebration, the journal, their first kiss, and everything that followed. She turned to find Giovannis watching her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. He reached out to trace her cheek with gentle fingers, as if ensuring she was real and not just a dream. "Good morning," he whispered, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," she replied. But even as the words left her lips, reality began to creep in around the edges of their perfect moment. Giovannis must have seen something change in her expression, because he propped himself up on one elbow, concern crossing his features. "What's wrong?" Reese sat up, pulling the silk sheet around herself as she gathered her thoughts. The Manhattan skyline stretched out beyond the windows, reminding her of all the complexities waiting in the world beyond this room. "Last night was beautiful," she began carefully, "more beautiful than I ever imagined it could be. But we need to talk about what happens next." Giovannis sat up as well, his dark hair tousled from sleep. "I thought we were past all the doubts and fears. I've changed, Reese. You've seen it yourself." "You have changed," she agreed, turning to face him fully. "And I believe in that change. But this isn't just about your personal transformation. It's about our professional reality." She stood, wrapping the sheet around herself as she walked to the window. The city was already alive below them, people rushing to their morning commitments, unaware of the drama unfolding in the penthouse above. "Do you know what they'll say when this gets out?" she asked, her reflection overlaying the cityscape. "They won't see two people who fell in love. They'll see the black female executive sleeping with her CEO." "Since when do you care what others think?" Giovannis challenged, joining her at the window. "This isn't about what I think or what you think." Reese turned to face him. It's about the reality of the world we live in. Everything I've accomplished, my innovations in ethical AI, my leadership in the industry, it could all be overshadowed by this relationship. So, what are you saying? His voice held a note of fear she'd never heard before. That last night was a mistake. No, she said softly, reaching up to touch his face. Last night was perfect, but I meant what I said before. I won't be just another conquest, another chapter in Giovannis Vespa's story. If we do this, it has to be real, all in. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You want me to marry you? I want you to want to marry me, she corrected. Not because it's an ultimatum, but because you see a future with me as your equal partner, both personally and professionally. Giovannis stepped back, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his way of processing complex emotions. Reese, you know how I feel about marriage, after watching my parents. I know, she interrupted gently, and that's exactly why we need to have this conversation now, before we go any further. Because I won't hide what we have, and I won't let our relationship undermine everything I've worked for. She moved to gather her clothes, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the emotion churning inside her. I need you to really think about what you want, Giovannis, not just in the heat of the moment, not just because last night was amazing, but in the long term. He caught her arm as she passed, his touch gentle but urgent. Don't leave like this. We can figure this out together. No, she said firmly, though her heart was breaking. This is something you need to figure out on your own. I know what I want, a partnership of equals, a love that isn't afraid to stand in the light, a future we build together. The question is, what do you want? As she dressed, Giovannis remained by the window, his reflection a study in internal conflict. She could see the battle playing out in his expression, his fear of repeating his parents' mistakes, warring with his feelings for her. You've come so far, she said softly, fully dressed now but lingering by the door. You've done the work to become someone capable of real love and connection, but this is the final wall, Giovannis, the one between wanting love and being brave enough to claim it completely. He turned to her then, his eyes full of emotion. What if I can't be what you need? Then at least we'll both know, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Better to face that truth now than to lose ourselves in something that can never be what we both deserve. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. I'm taking a few days off. I need space to think, and you need time to decide what you really want. Whatever you decide, know that last night was real and beautiful, and something I'll never regret. As she walked to the elevator, her heels clicking on the marble floor, Reese felt both stronger and more vulnerable than she'd ever been. She had laid her heart bare, stated her needs clearly, and now the choice was his. The next few days passed in a blur of emotional turmoil. Reese threw herself into work from her home office, reviewing code and attending virtual meetings while steadfastly avoiding checking her phone for messages from Giovannis. Her mother called on the second day, somehow sensing her daughter's distress from hundreds of miles away. "Baby girl," Sophia Holden's warm voice came through the speaker. "What's troubling you?" Reese found herself pouring out the whole story, the night of passion, the morning after, the choice she'd given Giovannis. Her mother listened without interruption, a skill honed through years of raising a brilliant but complicated daughter. "You did the right thing," Sophia said finally. "A man needs to choose you with his whole heart, not just because the moment swept him away." "But what if I asked for too much?" Reese whispered her deepest fear. "What if I pushed him away by demanding all or nothing?" "Then he wasn't ready for all that you are," her mother replied firmly. "You're not just some woman he can hide away or keep separate from his real life. You're Reese Holden, and you deserve someone who's proud to stand beside you in the light." The wisdom in her mother's words gave Reese strength, But the nights were still long and lonely. She found herself rereading entries from Giovannis's journal. He had insisted she keep it, tracing his journey of transformation and wondering if he had one more step to take, one more wall to break down. On the fourth day, Madison called. "He's been impossible," she reported, distracted in meetings, staring out windows, making the board members nervous with his lack of focus. "Whatever's going on between you two, please fix it before he accidentally sells the company to our biggest competitor." Reese appreciated the attempt at humor, but her heart ached knowing Giovannis was struggling. Still, she held firm. This was his choice to make, his fear to face, his final step toward becoming the man he could be. A week passed, then another. Reese returned to the office, maintaining professional composure through meetings and project reviews. If she and Giovannis interacted more formally than usual, if their eyes held shadows of unspoken words, no one dared to comment. She threw herself into the launch of their latest ethical AI initiative, working late into the night to avoid the emptiness of her apartment. The project was revolutionary, an AI system that could recognize and adjust for cultural biases in real time, making technology truly accessible and fair for all users. It should have been the crowning achievement of her career, but without Giovannis to share it with, the success felt hollow. She missed their late-night discussions, the way his mind challenged and complemented hers, how they could build on each other's ideas until something magical emerged. One evening, as she was preparing to present the initiative to a major tech conference, an email arrived from Dr. Martinez, Giovannis's therapist. "Reese," it read, "I don't usually contact my patients' loved ones, but Giovannis has given me permission to share something with you. In all my years of practice, I've never seen someone work harder to overcome their fears and become worthy of love. Whatever choice he makes, please know that you've already helped him become a better man than he ever thought he could be." Reese sat in her quiet office, letting tears fall freely for the first time since that morning in his penthouse. She had done the right thing, she knew that. Real love required courage, not just the courage to feel deeply, but the courage to choose that love every day, to stand beside your partner in the light, to build a future together without fear or reservation. Now all she could do was wait and see if Giovannis would find that courage within himself. Chapter 10. The Journey. The Manhattan summer arrived with oppressive heat, but Giovannis barely noticed the weather. His world had narrowed to an endless cycle of sleepless nights and distracted days, all centered around the choice Reese had laid before him. Marriage, the one commitment he'd sworn he'd never make after watching his parents' relationship crumble. His therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez became more frequent, more intense. On a particularly humid Tuesday morning, he found himself pacing her office, tie loosened, jacket discarded. "Tell me about your parents' marriage again," Dr. Martinez prompted, "but this time, I want you to think about it from your adult perspective, not through the eyes of the child you were." Giovannis paused by the window, watching heat waves distort the city skyline. They were so young when they came to America. My father was brilliant, driven, like me, I suppose. My mother... He trailed off, memory surfacing. She was his equal in every way. She learned English faster, adapted better to American culture. But somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing her as a partner. "And that's what you're afraid of becoming." "I've already become him in so many ways," Giovannis admitted. "The company, the success, the fear of real commitment. But Reese..." His voice softened at her name. "She makes me want to be different." That evening, instead of returning to his penthouse, Giovannis found himself driving to his childhood home in Queens. The modest house looked smaller than he remembered, its small garden now tended by his widowed mother. Maria Vespa opened the door with surprise that quickly turned to knowing understanding. "Ah, Fiam," she said softly, "come in. It's about time we had this talk." She led him to the kitchen, still the heart of the home, still smelling of paprika and comfort. As she prepared traditional Hungarian coffee, Giovannis noticed how her movements were slower now, but still graceful. "Tell me about her," Maria said, setting a cup before him. "How did you know?" His mother's smile was gentle. "A mother knows when her son's heart is troubled by love. Is she the one, the brilliant woman who challenges you?" Giovannis nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "Reese, she's extraordinary, Mama, but she wants marriage, a real partnership, after what happened with you and Papa." "Stop!" Maria interrupted firmly. "Your father and I made our own mistakes. We let pride and ambition poison what was beautiful, but that doesn't mean you're destined to repeat our story." She reached across the table to take his hand. "You know what your father's real failure was? Not his absence, not his work obsession. It was his fear. He was so afraid of failing as a husband and father that he never really tried to succeed at either." The words hit Giovannis hard, forcing him to confront his own fears. "How do you know when it's right, when it's worth the risk?" His mother's eyes grew distant. "There's a moment, Fiam, when you realize that the fear of losing someone outweighs the fear of committing to them. When you understand that all your success means nothing if you can't share it with the right person." Later that night, Giovannis found himself in his old bedroom, surrounded by memories, high school trophies, coding competition certificates, and there, tucked in a drawer, his parents' old wedding album. The photographs showed a younger version of his parents, their eyes bright with love and possibility. One image caught his attention. His father looking at his mother with unguarded adoration as she laughed at something off camera. What had happened to that love? When had fear and ambition replaced the joy in those early pictures? The next morning, Giovannis called an emergency board meeting. The members filed in, clearly concerned by his unusual behavior over the past weeks. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, standing before them, "about the future of this company, about what really matters in life and leadership." He took a deep breath. "I'm in love with Dr. Reese Holden. She's not just our lead AI ethics researcher. She's the woman I want to spend my life with. If that creates concerns about corporate governance, I'm open to restructuring my role or implementing any necessary oversight protocols, but I will not hide this relationship or pretend it's anything less than what it is." The room erupted in murmured discussions. Richard, the board member who had once dismissed Reese's concerns about algorithmic bias, spoke first. "This is highly irregular, Giovannis. The potential for conflicts of interest is exactly why I'm being transparent," Giovannis interrupted. "Reese's work stands on its own merit. Her innovations have transformed this company and the entire industry. I'm not asking for permission to love her. I'm informing you of my intention to build a future with her if she'll have me." To his surprise, several board members smiled. Eleanor Chen, their longest-serving member, spoke up. "It's about time. We've all seen how you two work together, how you bring out the best in each other. Love like that shouldn't be hidden." Over the next few days, Giovannis threw himself into planning. He consulted with corporate lawyers about ethical guidelines for their relationship, worked with HR to establish clear protocols for their professional interactions, and most importantly, began designing a future worthy of the woman he loved. He flew to Georgia to meet with Reese's parents, wanting to do things properly. Her father, the high school math teacher who had nurtured her love of numbers, grilled him about his intentions, while her mother watched with knowing eyes. "She's not just brilliant," James Holden said firmly. "She's our heart. If you're not ready to cherish all that she is, to stand beside her proudly—" "I am," Giovannis interrupted with quiet certainty. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." Back in New York, he visited his father's grave for the first time in years. The cemetery was quiet in the summer evening, cicadas singing in the distance. "I understand now, Papa," he said softly to the granite stone. "You were so afraid of failing that you never let yourself truly succeed at love. But I'm choosing a different path. I'm choosing to be brave." The final piece fell into place during a late-night session with Dr. Martinez. "What makes Reese different from everyone else you've known?" she asked. Giovannis didn't hesitate. "She sees me, really sees me. Not the successful CEO, not the immigrant son who made good, but the man I am and the man I could be. She challenges me to be better while accepting who I am right now." "And what do you want with her?" "Everything," he replied, the truth of it suddenly crystal clear. "A partnership, a future, a life where we build something meaningful together. I want to wake up beside her every morning and share every success and failure. I want to be brave enough to love her the way she deserves to be loved." "Then what are you still doing here?" Dr. Martinez asked with a smile. That night, Giovanni sat in his penthouse office, writing one final entry in a new journal, one he hoped would be the first chapter of their shared story. The city lights twinkled below, each one representing a dream, a possibility, a future waiting to be claimed. Tomorrow, he would take the biggest risk of his life, not because Reese had given him an ultimatum, but because she had given him something far more precious, the courage to believe in love again. Chapter 11. The Proposal. The New York Public Library stood majestic in the early morning light, its marble lions guarding secrets as old as the city itself. Giovannis had chosen this location carefully, not just for its grandeur, but for what it represented. This was where Reese's mother had cultivated her love of learning, where knowledge and dreams intersected, where stories of love and courage had been preserved for generations. He had arranged everything meticulously, working with the library's board of directors to get special access before opening hours. The Rosemane reading room, with its celestial ceiling and towering windows, would be their stage. But first, he had to get her there. The message he sent was simple. "Meet me at the library at 7 a.m. There's something I need to show you." Reese arrived precisely on time, her professional armor firmly in place despite the early hour. She found Giovannis waiting at the top of the grand staircase, holding not a ring box, as she might have expected, but a leather-bound journal similar to the one he'd shared with her that night in his office. "What's this about, Giovannis?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Follow me," he said softly, leading her through the quiet halls to the reading room. The space took her breath away. Morning light streamed through the towering windows, creating halos around the hundreds of books he'd arranged on a central table. Each book had been chosen with purpose. Works on artificial intelligence ethics, Hungarian folklore, African-American history, mathematics, and love stories from every culture. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Giovannis began, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space, "about stories, the ones we inherit, the ones we tell ourselves, and the ones we choose to write." He opened the journal in his hands. "My father's story was one of ambition overwhelming love. For years, I thought that was my story too. But then you came into my life, challenging every assumption, breaking down every wall." Reese stood very still, her eyes moving from the carefully arranged books to his face. "Giovannis, please," he said gently, "let me finish. This journal contains every reason why I love you, every way you've changed me, every dream I have for our future. But more than that, it contains my promise to be brave enough to write a new story with you." He began to read from the journal, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Day 1. Today I told the board about us. Not because you demanded it, but because I'm proud of loving you. Because what we have deserves to stand in the light. Day 7. Flew to Georgia to meet your parents. Your father's chess set reminded me of the one my father left behind in Budapest. Two men from different worlds who taught their children to think deeply, to question everything. I want our children to have that same curiosity, that same courage to challenge the status quo. Day 15. Met with corporate lawyers about restructuring the company's leadership. Not because I have to, but because I want to build something that honors both our professional integrity and our personal love. You've taught me that real partnership means supporting each other's dreams without compromise. He continued reading, each entry revealing another facet of his journey toward this moment. When he finally looked up, Reese's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "The last entry is blank," he said, turning to the final page, "because I want us to write it together. But first—" He set the journal down and reached into his pocket, pulling out not a modern ring box but an antique Hungarian locket. Inside was a ring that combined elements of both their heritages, African diamonds set in a traditional Hungarian design. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me with a warning: only give this to someone who makes you want to be better, who challenges you to grow, who sees your soul and loves you anyway." Dropping to one knee on the historic floor, Giovannis looked up at the woman who had transformed his life. "Reese Holden, you are the most brilliant, challenging, inspiring person I've ever known. You pushed me to confront my fears, to become worthy of real love. Will you help me write our story together? Will you marry me?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Reese looked at the ring, at the books surrounding them, at the journal that chronicled his transformation. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You did all this because you deserve a proposal as extraordinary as you are," he finished. "Because I want to show you that I understand what real partnership means. This isn't just about marriage, it's about building a future together, about combining our strengths to make something greater than either of us could achieve alone." He stood, taking her hands in his. "I've already restructured the company's leadership to ensure your work will always be judged on its own merits. I've established a foundation in both our names to support minorities in tech. I've done everything I can think of to prove that I'm ready for this, ready for us." "And if I say no?" she asked, though her eyes told a different story. "Then I'll keep proving myself worthy until you believe in us as much as I do," he replied without hesitation. "But I'm hoping you'll say yes, because I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Reese reached for the journal, reading through some of the entries he hadn't shared. Her fingers traced his words about their future, about the legacy they could build together, about the children they might have who would combine the best of both their worlds. "You really want all of this?" she asked. "Marriage, family, a true partnership." "I want everything with you," he said simply. "The professional success is meaningless without someone to share it with. And there's no one I'd rather share my life with than you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing all the changes that had led to this moment. The driven CEO was still there, but tempered now with emotional intelligence, with vulnerability, with the courage to love completely. "When did you become so wise?" she asked softly. "When I met someone worth becoming wise for," he replied. Then, with a hint of his old impatience, "Reese, you're killing me here. Will you marry me?" Her laugh echoed through the grand space, joyous and free. "Yes," she said, pulling him close. "Yes to marriage, yes to partnership, yes to writing our story together." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the morning sun broke fully through the windows, bathing them in golden light. The books around them stood as witnesses to their commitment, not just to love, but to growth, to partnership, to building something meaningful together. They sealed their engagement with a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future. When they finally parted, Johannes pulled her close, whispering Hungarian endearments his mother had taught him for this moment. "I have one condition," Reese said, her eyes twinkling. "Anything. We announce this at the company together, as equals, as partners." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he replied. "In fact, I have some ideas about expanding our ethical AI division under your leadership." She silenced him with another kiss. "Business later. Right now, I just want to be here with you, in this moment." They stayed in the reading room until the library opened, adding the first words to their blank page together. Outside, New York City woke to a new day, unaware that within its historic walls, two people had just begun writing a love story for the ages. Chapter 12. A new chapter. The Brooklyn Botanic Garden was in full bloom on the morning of their wedding, cherry blossoms creating a pink canopy over the ceremony space. Reese stood before a vintage mirror in the garden's historic palm house, her mother and bridesmaids fussing with the train of her custom-designed gown, a masterpiece that combined African patterns with contemporary elegance. "You look like a queen," Sophia Holden whispered, adjusting her daughter's veil. The delicate lace had been handmade by Hungarian artisans, a gift from Maria Vespa, who had embraced Reese as the daughter she never had. The dress itself told their story. The bodice featured subtle patterns inspired by traditional Hungarian embroidery, while the flowing skirt incorporated African motifs that honored Reese's heritage. Like their love, it was a beautiful fusion of cultures, traditions, and modern sensibilities. In another part of the garden, Johannes stood with his groomsmen, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his bow tie. The morning sun filtered through the cherry blossoms, casting dappled shadows on his custom tuxedo, which featured subtle details that matched Reese's dress. "Your father would be proud," his mother said, approaching to straighten his tie herself. "Not just of this day, but of the man you've become." The ceremony space had been transformed into a celebration of their joined cultures. Hungarian folk artists had created intricate decorations that intertwined with African art pieces, while tech-inspired elements nodded to their shared professional passion. The result was as unique as their love story. Their wedding program included an elegant code snippet that Reese had written, an algorithm for love that made their tech industry guests smile in appreciation. Johannes had responded with his own addition, a complex equation that, when solved, spelled out, "Forever yours." The guests represented their diverse worlds. Tech industry leaders sat alongside Reese's family from Georgia and Johannes's relatives from Hungary. Their Vespa Industries employees were there too, including Madison, who had helped orchestrate their love story from the beginning. When the music began, a fusion of Hungarian folk melodies and African-American spiritual harmonies, Reese began her walk down the petal-strewn aisle on her father's arm. The collective gasp from the guests was audible as they took in her radiant beauty. Johannes turned to see his bride, and for a moment, everything else faded away. He was transported back to that first interview when she had walked into his office and changed his life forever. Now here she was, walking toward their future together. Their vows were deeply personal, reflecting their journey from colleagues to soulmates. Johannes spoke first, his voice strong despite his emotion. "Reese, you came into my life like a challenge to everything I thought I knew. You made me question my assumptions, face my fears, and become worthy of real partnership. I promise to continue growing with you, to support your dreams as fiercely as my own, and to write our story together with courage and love." Reese's vows followed, her words touching every heart in attendance. "Johannes, you proved that real love is worth any risk. You showed me that we don't have to choose between professional success and personal happiness. We can build both together. I promise to challenge you when you need it, support you when you doubt, and love you through every chapter of our story." The exchange of rings carried special significance. Giovannis's band featured an inscription in both Hungarian and English, "Love brave enough to grow." Reese's wedding band was designed to complement her engagement ring, the metals intertwining like their lives. After they were pronounced husband and wife, their kiss was met with joyous applause. Cherry blossom petals danced in the spring breeze as they walked back down the aisle together, now partners in every sense. The reception was a celebration of their multicultural love story. Hungarian goulash was served alongside Southern soul food, while their cake featured layers inspired by both their heritage. Their first dance was to a specially composed piece that blended traditional music from both their backgrounds. During the father-daughter dance, James Holden held his daughter close. "I always knew you'd change the world," he said softly. "I just didn't know you'd find someone worthy to change it with you." Later, as Giovannis danced with his mother, Maria wiped happy tears from her eyes. "This is what real love looks like," she said. "Not perfect, but perfectly matched." The speeches touched on both their professional achievements and personal growth. Madison's toast had everyone laughing as she recounted their obvious attraction during late-night coding sessions. But it was Eleanor Chen, their senior board member, who captured the essence of their union. In business, we talk about synergy, when two elements combine to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Reese and Giovannis have shown us that the same principle applies to love. Together, they're not just building a marriage, they're creating a legacy of ethical innovation and courageous love. As the evening progressed, Giovannis pulled Reese away from the celebration for a quiet moment in the garden. The setting sun painted the sky in colors that reminded them of their first kiss on that Boston terrace. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her close. "More than happy," she replied. "Complete." He pulled out a small package. One more surprise. Inside was a new journal, its leather cover embossed with both their names. The first page held their wedding date and a simple message: "The beginning of our greatest collaboration. For our next chapter," he explained, "and all the chapters after." Their honeymoon would take them first to Budapest, where Giovannis would show Reese the city of his ancestors, the cafes and castles that had shaped his family's history. Then they would travel to Georgia, where Reese would share her own roots, the places and people that had molded her into the woman he loved. But their greatest adventure would be the life they would build together. They had already begun expanding Vespa Industries' ethical AI initiatives, creating programs to support minorities in tech, and establishing a foundation to help immigrant entrepreneurs. Their love story had transformed not just their lives, but their entire industry. They showed that success didn't require sacrificing personal happiness, that professional partnership could coexist with romantic love, that being vulnerable didn't mean being weak. As the reception continued around them, they remained in their quiet corner of the garden, wrapped in each other's arms. The cherry blossoms continued to fall, nature's confetti blessing their union. "Ready to write our next chapter?" Reese asked, her eyes sparkling with joy and possibility. "With you?" "Always," Giovannis replied, drawing her into a kiss that felt both like a beginning and a continuation. The next beautiful page in their ongoing story. Above them, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, each one a witness to their love, each one a promise of the adventures yet to come. They had proven that love, when combined with courage and commitment, could break down any wall, overcome any fear, and write stories more beautiful than either of them had imagined possible. Their greatest chapter was just beginning. Subscribe if you loved.